When we think about how the Bible got to us today, we usually imagine a pretty straightforward story of careful preservation. But what if it wasn't? What if the real story is something completely different? Today, we're diving into a source that lays out a wild alternative history, one that involves Roman spies, incredible forgeries, and a secret imperial project that went on for 1,000 years. Let's follow this paper trail.
So to really get our heads around this theory, we're going to follow the author's argument step by step. First, we'll talk about how none of us see things with a completely fresh pair of eyes. Then we'll get into why putting the Bible back together is like a giant puzzle with the most important pieces missing. From there, we'll see a full-on attack on the very science used to solve that puzzle, and we'll unpack these explosive claims of forgery. And finally, we'll look at the totally different history that this source wants us to consider instead.
Okay, so the first big idea our source wants us to get on board with is actually pretty simple, but it's powerful. It's that none of us read anything with a blank slate. Our own world, our culture, our point in history, our life experiences, it all acts like a filter, coloring every single word we read and shaping what it means to us.
And that leads to this huge question. If you and someone from a totally different time and place read the exact same sentence, are you really reading the same story? According to our source, the answer is a big fat no. Because the meaning isn't just sitting there on the page, it's something we create in the space between the text and our own reality.
And this slide is the perfect example of what we're talking about. Look at these paintings of the same biblical scene. The artists weren't trying to mess up history. They just couldn't help but paint the ancient world through the only lens they had, their own medieval world. So a peasant girl from Nazareth ends up looking like a European queen. This idea that we can't help but see the past through the filter of our own present is the key that unlocks this entire argument.
So, if our own eyes are biased, our source asks a pretty pointed question. What about the eyes of the scholars who pieced the Bible together? And this is where the argument shifts gears, moving from a cool philosophical idea to a direct assault on the science of biblical reconstruction.
This right here is the fundamental problem for every single scholar in this field. The autographs, the original scrolls actually written by Matthew or Paul or John, are gone. They're just lost to history. All we have are thousands of copies made from other copies, stretching over centuries. And the real kicker? They don't all say the same thing. So how on earth do you figure out what the original said?
Well, the standard answer is this field called textual criticism. It's this whole academic discipline with a set of rules designed to sort through all the variations to figure out the most likely original reading. But get this, our source basically throws that entire field out the window. It argues this isn't science at all, but just a collection of subjective observations and arbitrary rules.
And this is where things get really intense. The source doesn't just disagree, it takes direct aim at the core rules that scholars have been using for generations. The very rules that were used to create the Greek text that sits behind almost every modern Bible on the shelf today.
Okay, so rule number 1 is this: prefer the more difficult reading. The idea is that a scribe is way more likely to fix a confusing sentence than they are to make an easy one harder. So the awkward version is probably the original. But our source says that's an absurd presupposition. It argues that this entire rule is built on the idea that the people copying the Bible were basically sloppy, careless amateurs.
Instead of sloppy amateurs, the source paints a completely different picture. It argues that once Christianity became the state religion of Rome, copying the Bible wasn't some casual hobby. It was a serious, state matter, handled by elite government scribes. And in that world, making an error wasn't just a simple mistake, it was a crime that could get you killed. This wasn't a quiet library project, it was a high-stakes government operation.
All right, rule number 2 is basically quality over quantity. This means that a couple of the oldest, most complete manuscripts we have, specifically the famous Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus from the 4th century, are given way more weight than thousands of later copies all put together. But according to our source, this whole principle is worthless because it's built on a complete fraud.
And there it is, the absolute bombshell at the heart of this entire argument. The claim is that these two prized ancient manuscripts, the very cornerstones of modern biblical scholarship, are not what they seem. The source flat out claims they are forgeries.
And the third big rule is kind of like different is better. It works like this. Let's say Matthew and Luke tell the same story, but they use slightly different words. The thinking is that a scribe copying them would be tempted to make them match up, to harmonize them. So the version where they don't match is probably the original one.
Our author just scoffs at this rule. Why?
because the whole system depends on those two star manuscripts, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. And the source just hammers this point home. Not only do they disagree with almost every other copy out there, they can't even agree with each other, allegedly disagreeing dozens of times on every single page.
So, you can't just throw around a word like forgery without some kind of proof, right? Let's dig into the case that our source actually makes. It lays out a very specific and pretty conspiratorial story to back all this up.
The story our source tells zeroes in on the Codex Sinaiticus, and it sounds like something out of a spy novel. It points to this 19th century guy, a scholar named Constantine Simonides, who actually came forward and publicly announced that he had forged the whole thing when he was a young monk. Then the source alleges a cover-up, claiming that when the British Museum eventually bought the manuscript, a key page that Simonides said had his signature on it, the final proof, was conveniently left behind in Russia.
Then, our source points to this number as the hard evidence. It claims that the Codex Sinaiticus is riddled with over 23,000 corrections made by later scribes. For the author, this is the smoking gun. A professional government scribe working on a perfect state document wouldn't make thousands of mistakes, but an inexpert monk trying to forge a document, well, that fits Simonides' story perfectly. This number is presented as forensic proof of fraud.
So all of this leads to what the source presents as the great betrayal of modern scholarship. It claims these two supposedly fraudulent manuscripts were used back in the 19th century by two scholars, Westcott and Hort, who the source calls, and I'm quoting here, Satanists, to create a new modern Greek text. And it's this text, the source argues, that became the corrupted foundation for almost every modern Bible translation you can buy today, except notably for the King James Version.
Okay, so if the entire world of modern scholarship is built on forgeries, like this source claims, then what's the real story? How did we get the Bible? Well, the author doesn't just tear everything down. They build a really detailed, step-by-step alternate history to put in its place.
And this next part might be the most jaw-dropping claim of them all. The theory goes like this. The Gospels weren't written from memory years and years later. No, they were based on verbatim transcripts that were created by hostile spies, professional scribes working for the Romans and Pharisees, who followed Jesus around, writing down every word he said for their intelligence files. Then, after these spies converted to Christianity, they donated their official records to the church, and the apostles just edited these transcripts into the four Gospels.
So if the Gospels started as official records, it kind of makes sense that they'd be preserved officially, right? That's the argument here. That for over 1,000 years, the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, treated the Bible like a foundational state document. It was preserved not by random monks, but by the full might of the state, using the best materials and the most skilled government scribes to create a perfect, unbroken chain of copies.
And this unbroken chain, according to the source, leads us straight to one specific book. The theory is that when Constantinople fell in the 1450s, all of these perfectly preserved imperial manuscripts came flooding into Western Europe. A scholar named Erasmus gathered them up to create what became known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text. And it was this text, coming from the empire's official copies, that was then used to translate the King James Version of the Bible, which, in the author's view, makes it the one and only reliable English translation.
And so we get to the final verdict. On one side, you have this pure text supposedly preserved by an empire for 1,000 years. On the other side, you have the entire project of modern biblical scholarship, which the source sees as a complete disaster. It argues that modern scholars abandoned that pure stream and instead chose to rely on a couple of forgery codices, analyzed them with 3 evil rules, and ended up creating what the author considers to be corrupted modern Bibles. At the end of the day, the source material we've just walked through gives one very radical and incredibly detailed answer to this question. It's a powerful reminder that every history we read is a narrative. And when the original evidence is gone for good, the fight over which story to believe and whose rules we should use to decide, well, that becomes the most important story of all.